Good afternoon. Good afternoon. You guys are worse than a college classroom. Okay, so this panel this afternoon has its origins in the Council of Communication Associations, and it evolved out of there, as Carol can tell you, in a meeting in the spring. And as you may know, AJHA is a member of the council, along with 5 other organizations, now 6, I guess, other organizations. And the conversation at that meeting was about trying to get the organizations to collaborate on various types of things, and one of them was to try to bring cross-disciplinary representatives of those organizations to conferences for panels and research presentations and those kinds of things. And AJHA happened to be the convention that was first up from that time, and so we put this panel together as sort of this first effort to first step in collaborating the organizations under the CCA. And so, starting with your right, my left, all the way to the end, I'm going to do the introductions here, and we can, then each panelist is going to talk for about 5 to 10 minutes, and then the hope is that we'll have plenty of time for people to get in discussion. I think the topic is ripe for that. Gwin Faulconer-Lippert, down on the far end, served on the board of the Broadcast Education Association, which is in fact also a member of CCA, from 2003 to 2008 as a representative for the 2-year and small colleges. She's a professor of mass media communications at Oklahoma City Community College, just completed her 30th anniversary as a talk host on KTOK AM 1000. She interviewed surviving family members in the field and facilitated live on-air grief counseling following the 1992 bombing of the Murrah building, received a commendation for her efforts. Gwin holds 2 degrees, both from the University of Oklahoma. We won't hold that against her. She currently is serving her 2nd term as the president of the Oklahoma Broadcast Education Association, and I believe she has a rather poignant story about the day of the bombing, which involves her husband, Rick, who is back on the camera back there. Am I correct about that? I have not heard the story from you.
My best husband.
Your best husband. Well, we like it. We like it when the best spouses come to AJHA. So, sitting next to Gwin is Kevin Johnson, who covers the Justice Department and national law enforcement issues for USA Today. Since joining the newspaper in 1994, Johnson's assignments have included the O.J. Simpson murder trial in Los Angeles, the Oklahoma City bombing, investigation and trials of Timothy Mcveigh and Terry Nichols, and all the way to witnessing the execution of Timothy McVeigh, exploring the ways in which, the Columbine High School and Virginia Tech shooting incidents, the special counsel investigation into President Clinton, the 9/11 attacks, and the Boston Marathon bombings. Earlier this year, Johnson was part of a team of reporters recognized with the James Aronson Award for Social Justice Journalism for USA Today's series on mental illness in America. Before joining USA Today, he worked at the Los Angeles Times and the San Antonio Light, the late departed San Antonio Light, where I was the city editor who sent Kevin to cover his first execution. So he has 2 under his belt. One of them happens to be McVeigh. And boy, do we remember that one, don't we? Jody Madeira is on faculty of the School of Law at Indiana University, Her scholarly interests primarily involve the intersection of law and emotion in criminal and family law. That's quite an endorsement. Did you bring that along? Was that? Yeah. Her book is called Killing Mcveigh, The Death Penalty and the Myth of Closure.
That one love is you. There's only been one love for me. That one love is you.
Somebody want to dance?
Yeah, baby, there's only one love for me.
How do we tie him into the presentation?
Johnny Mercer from Savannah, Georgia. He was asking what his favorite popular song was of all time. He said, "Song written by."
Rick, did you get all that?
Yes, sir.
Okay.
We have to pay royalties on that music.
Oh, no. HHA will have to get its legal counsel on that immediately. Okay, we good to go? All good? Okay. Okay, so if you didn't get the name of the book, it's Killing Mcveigh, The Death Penalty and the Myth of Closure, in which she applied collective memory to criminal prosecution and sentencing. It explores the ways in which victims, families, and survivors came to comprehend and cope with the Oklahoma City bombing through membership in community groups as well as through attendance and participation in Timothy McVeigh's prosecution and execution. Additionally, Madeira investigates the effects of legal proceedings, verdicts, and sentences upon victims' families, the role of empathy in personal injury litigation, and the impact of recent developments in capital victim services upon the relationship between victims' families and the criminal justice system. We're going to start today with a presentation by Jody.
Hopefully without Fred Astaire. That was the best introduction I've ever had, bar none. So this is my book, and I have to tell you, since it came out in 2012, I've largely turned away from these topics because although I keep interviewing family members and survivors from Boston, lowered about a foot, and Aurora and 9/11, I think my heart has always been in Oklahoma City. I interviewed 33 family members and survivors from 2004 to 2006, so shortly after Mcveigh's execution, shortly after Nichols was being tried in Oklahoma, and then again in 2009 to 2011. And what I found really changed my life. When I met these folks, I was a dissertation student at Annenberg, University of Pennsylvania, and I just was interested in questions of closure. And I just was interested in the execution. And actually what I found out was that the question of closure began, of course, the moment the bomb went off. But it didn't end with Mcveigh's execution. In fact, the key events were not the execution or the capital trials of Mcveigh and Nichols, but actually the building of the National Memorial, the coming together of family members and survivors. So the book talks about those processes. Today I'll mostly be focusing, however, on a different topic, which is the media portrayals of Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols. So as you recall, Stephen Jones took a unique media strategy with Mcveigh. Here was a young man who looked spare, looked harsh, looked kind of militaristic, looked scary. And he wanted to humanize him. So he introduced Mcveigh to various journalists, starting with a Newsweek interview not too long after the bombing, I believe just a matter of months. And Mcveigh began to correspond with journalists, and this correspondence would lead ultimately to many relationships with reporters over the years, from his first arrest to his execution, culminating in an authorized biography called The American Terrorist by Lou Michel, and which was really interesting, had a very interesting effect on family members and survivors. And so two things came out of this. The first is that media practices of covering Timothy McVeigh, his trial and his execution, changed somewhat because of this relationship. He was corresponding directly with journalists who were also in close touch with family members and survivors. And of course, you could imagine how that could create friction between the media who wanted to get and remain close to both sources, but whose heart was with the family members and survivors. And so there evolved a collaboration where the journalists would write with McVeigh, and they would report on the contents of this correspondence, but actually they would reveal what was being said to family members and survivors ahead of time. So they would not re-traumatize them more than necessary, so that people would know what McVeigh was saying. And I thought that this outgrowth of new media practices in the coverage of McVeigh's trial and execution in particular was very interesting. The second thing that came about was that the media, I believe, played an interesting role in McVeigh's execution. Of course, McVeigh would have been executed if the media never wrote a drop about him, just as an outgrowth of the criminal justice process. But the media practices changed how family members and survivors talked about, negotiated these years, particularly the years between his trial and his execution. So McVeigh was on the front of so many magazines. He was on so many television shows, from Time magazine to Ed Bradley in 2001, I believe an award-winning interview. And McVeigh was always on the forefront, always on the front page, always on the evening news. And they got so tired of him. One of my live witnesses to the execution said to me, McVeigh had to die because every time he is talking to the media, he is basically doing it to re-traumatize the victims' families. He is doing it to get at us. And Nichols is quiet, and so I can live with Nichols being alive. Of course, this is after Nichols' trial and before after his federal trial and before his state trial. So at that point, they thought that saga was done, and the death penalty was out of reach permanently for Nichols. But it was very interesting how both perpetrators' media personalities, very different media personalities, led to a willingness to coexist with Nichols because he was already silent, and an unwillingness, in fact, a determination, not only to not coexist with McVeigh, but also a drive to witness his execution. And so one of the things I talked with many people about was the drive to open up McVeigh's execution. Ultimately, 242 people witnessed his execution, I believe, 10 live in Terre Haute, Indiana, which is about an hour west of Bloomington, where I live, and 232 at the FAA Center in Oklahoma City. And this had drastic repercussions, not only for their sense. It wasn't a retributive sense from which they wanted to witness the execution. They spoke of completeness, of wanting to walk out and know that he was no longer breathing the same air as they were breathing. An urge to see this thing through, an urge to seek justice, an urge to silence McVeigh. In fact, if you look at many of the quotes in my book, where people could have said execute, McVeigh is being executed, they drop in the word silence instead. McVeigh is being silenced. And they never spoke of Nichols being silenced in that same manner. So for this panel, I'd like to just leave that out there. The idea of McVeigh's execution being a way to silence him, and particularly in light of other recent prosecutions, Tsarnaev, Holmes, right, the forefront, how we always put these perpetrators on the front page, and how we're starting, or perhaps starting to realize the effects that this can have and pull back from this practice a bit to focus on other pictures, other images, other narratives, other stories. Because this had a lot to do with the closure that they had, right? The McVeigh's execution was not solely because of his role in the bombing. I believe it ultimately started with Stephen Jones's strategy of putting McVeigh before the cameras, before the reporters, and that culminated in McVeigh, a felt need to silence McVeigh, perhaps, in addition to see him held accountable for his role in the bombing. Thank you.
Hi, good afternoon. Fred's introduction mentioned that I work for USA Today, so following that tradition, I will be brief. There are so many firsts that defined the Oklahoma City bombing. Many are still very, very painful for people to recall 20 years on, and it's hard to believe that it is 20 years since that day. But I think one of the legacies that I'd like to talk about, in addition to being part of the media horde that covered and negotiated and rode our way through this journey, is a legacy that I think that Jody just touched on, that was often overlooked or not fully appreciated by reporters like me and others who covered this case. And that's the legacy of victims' rights that played out here from the time of the bombing until, well, I think it still continues today. Consider this, among the many, in the time between the bombing and the trials of Mcveigh and Nichols, victims advocates won not one, but 2 acts of Congress, which is remarkable in itself. Those don't come easy. People work for years in victims advocacy to do that. But this group, a coalition of groups, did it in a matter of months and a couple of years. One of those was extraordinary. All of them were extraordinary, but one sort of set the mark for what this campaign was all about. And it was when they secured the right to have a closed-circuit broadcast from the courtroom back to victims in Oklahoma City, the courthouse in Denver back to Oklahoma City. Now, I'd like you to think about that for a moment, because I don't think we put it in the context that it deserved at the time. This happened at a moment when the federal judicial system resisted cameras, any kind of camera, a still camera. They objected to the placement of cartoonists, or I shouldn't say, drawing artists, courtroom artists in the courtroom. They resisted it at every turn. It also came on the heels of the televised circus that was the O.J. Simpson trial. I don't know if I was unfortunate or lucky enough to have a little bit of a view into that at the time, but I always think of it as like sitting in the balcony of a surgical theater, where you have operators, or doctors, surgeons, just butchering the patient in front of you, and there's nothing you can do. And the only person who could do something at that time was Judge Ito, if you remember Judge Ito, and he had lost control from the very opening gavel. Now, I don't know what your memories are of the O.J. Simpson trial. Some of you are probably too young to remember it. Some of you probably remember it well. Anybody have a memory of that case? Yes, in the back.
In terms of what?
Just what when somebody says O.J. Simpson trial, what comes to your mind?
Black reaction, white reaction.
Okay. Right here, I think I saw your,
If it fits, you must acquit.
right. Anybody else?
My student couldn't come to class because they had to stay home and watch it on TV.
Right. All of these things, they have these sort of iconic, there's an iconic part of it that everybody has a memory of it. My memory of it as watching it up close was the incessant delays, days upon days where nothing happened. Open squabbling between lawyers and the judge. And the judge himself, who was, pretty much in way, way over his head. But this was the time when there was consideration of whether or not to broadcast this trial. And I can recall Stephen Jones, who was just in here a little while ago, Judge Mach, the visiting judge from Denver who oversaw the trial, the prosecutors, all vehemently against it. But there was nothing they could do because Congress, because of the enormity of what happened, acted and gave the victims what they wanted. It was extraordinary. And I don't think that 20 years on we really appreciated, or actually at the time we really appreciated what was going on. Now we get a sense of what they accomplished because everything they accomplished back then is now being applied today, with few exceptions. There were a few exceptions in Boston. But in the trials of the so-called 20th hijacker of 9/11, all of the template that was set in Oklahoma City was set at 9/11, was repeated at 9/11. There was a closed circuit broadcast of that trial from Alexandria, Virginia, back to New York. It just happened. And if it wasn't for what the victims' advocates did here, it wouldn't have happened. And perhaps just as groundbreaking, and it was almost unfathomable at the time, was extending that closed circuit broadcast of the trial to the execution itself. I remember thinking in the weeks before all this was going on, there's just absolutely no way this is going to happen. There was talk that the signal would be pirated, that there would be retaliation by sympathizers of Mcveigh. And then there was this unlikely figure of John Ashcroft, who was the Attorney General at the time. No way John Ashcroft is going to approve this deal. But he came here and he met with about 100 victims' family members. And I remember him walking out of a building downtown, I can't remember the building where this meeting took place, and he was visibly shaken. And I remember talking with the other journalists there at the time, and we thought, he's going to do it. And sure enough, it was before the van took off with his entourage in tow, we got, some background word that it was going to happen. Now, I mean, one of these things happening is extraordinary. But to have a succession of events like this happen within months is something that usually takes decades, especially when you're talking about the federal court system. And I just think that at that time, we were so consumed with every bit of new testimony coming out, every piece of evidence that was presented, that we wrote about it, but we never gave it the weight that I think it deserved. Because what happened here, the bombing, obviously extraordinarily tragic, historically tragic, but the response was also historic. And I think that people need to appreciate that, and I think as a journalist, we didn't really appreciate that as it happened. Thank you very much.
After April 19th, 1995, I received some commendation. I received a plaque that said, "Years behind the microphone could not have prepared you for this." And it was right. was absolutely right. My story is one that any person in Oklahoma City probably has a similar story, but because I choose to kind of look at the lighter side of things, I hope that I can take you on this journey with me. April 19th, 1995, if you go through the memorial, you'll see that people in Oklahoma City were just going about their day. They were living their life. They were dropping their kids off at school. They were doing things like that. Well, I had a pretty unique situation. I had just gotten engaged. And I lived in Norman, Oklahoma with my daughter. My handsome husband, however, lived at Northwest 120th in Oklahoma City. And you know how when you're engaged, you'll do anything to see that person? So I got up, dropped my daughter off at school, drove from Norman, which is 30 miles south, to Northwest 120th. Now, the memorial's at Northwest 5th. So 120th, just for a few minutes to see my fiance. And it was all under the guise of he had a bit of exercise equipment and I could work out before I went to work. So I arrived at his house at about 8:30 and he answered the door and I went, "Oh, honey, how are you?" And he said, "I'm sorry, I've got to go. I've got work downtown. I think I'm in the Federal Building." And he had on a purple shirt. And I said, "Okay." Well, I gave him a big kiss, and I went in, and I got on the treadmill, and I'm doing the treadmill, and he had a beagle that would smile at me while I was on the treadmill. And I'm working, and I'm working, and working, and then all of a sudden, the house at 120th shook as though it was at Northwest 5th. The explosion was incredible, and it shook all of Oklahoma City North. And Channel 9 came on, and local anchor Tammy Payne came on and said there has been a terrible explosion downtown. They went to their sky cameras, you know, that was one of the first ones. You could see the smoke billowing, all that, and all I could think of is my fiance is in that building, whatever it is. And so for an hour and a half, I was on that treadmill, watching TV, on that treadmill, because I didn't know what else to do. And finally, then at 10:30, I got a phone call. It was Rick, and he said, "I'm okay." I was in the county building, which was the block south. It blew out all the windows. He said, "I walked over and looked out, and I could see through the Murrah building. But I'm okay." And then he said, "But I think they're saying there's another bomb. And I'm going to go." And I went, "No, you're not. Where are you? Let's arrange a meeting place. I'm coming to get you, honey." And so we agreed we would meet at the Myriad Gardens. Now, you've got to remember, I'm a young woman on her second husband wanting to look beautiful, so I went in and tried to put on makeup. And as I was putting on my makeup, I was sobbing, so I had streaks and streaks. I put on clothes. Crazy, crazy, crazy thing. And I got in the car, and I thought, how am I going to get past all those policemen? Well, I had worked for a radio station all my life. And when I show you what I did, you're not going to believe it. I pulled up to the police roadblock, and I pulled out a little green card that said, "Press." 1995, this is all the credentials you needed. And I went over, and I picked up Rick Lippert, and we came home, and little did I know, because of that, I did not know where he was for, an hour and a half or whatever, I developed post-traumatic stress disorder. My radio station called and said, "Would you be willing to cover this?" And I said, "Sure." Well, the rest of the story is KTOK radio was in 50 Penn Place, it still is, and it was the talk station, #1 talk station in town. It was on the K floor, but on floors 14 and 15, I think it is, the FBI was there. And so the feeling is that the next building to be bombed would be 50 Penn Place. So security came and sent everybody out of 50 Penn Place, and so every person in the radio station was now covering the Oklahoma City bombing. I want you to think about 1995. What do you remember about cell phones? They were not like this. They were batteries with earpieces. Do you remember this? I mean, car batteries. I mean, they were huge. And it turns out the young woman at our station was driving down Robinson. She stopped at the light at 9 o'clock. The light changed. She pulled past it and just got past it, and the Murrah building blew up. She called our radio station and said, "Something has happened. Put me on." And so our radio station was the first radio station to start the coverage. And for the next week, we were the mouthpiece of Oklahoma City, and we broadcast to the world. The FBI came in and told everybody they had to leave. My news director, Jerry Bonin, who later won the Edward R. Murrah Award, stayed there and broadcast 24 hours, 24/7, and they would call a different person to come in, but there was no way to communicate with one another. The rest of the story is, the bombing happened on Wednesday. On Monday of that week, they came in and we had a wonderful audio board. They tore it out because they were moving us from the K floor to the 11th floor. So they tore out our master board and put in a little, almost board with 4 little pots. It was 1 step above 2 tin cans and a string, I promise. And you couldn't communicate with anyone in the field, so they would have to go, "Gwin has a report from the Family Center, don't you, Gwin Faulconer?" And I would go, I would hear on the radio, and I would pick up my phone and go, "Yes, I do have a report from the Family Center." Now, I talked about the post-traumatic stress that I developed as a result of this. And what I want to leave with you today are some things. I want to talk about my personal story. But as a result of the Oklahoma City bombing, you made reference to this, the Oklahoma Standard became a part of everybody's vocabulary. The Oklahoma Standards is that we do everything to the best of our ability, and we do it right. And I think the memorial speaks to that, certainly the family groups, everything like that. But also, what came out of the Oklahoma Standard was something called the DART Center. How many of you all are familiar with the DART Center? Good. Those of you that aren't, I'm going to tell you about the DART Center. The DART Center was actually started as an award for coverage, journalistic coverage of traumatic events. And they recognized outstanding reporting across the world. I believe it started at Michigan State University. And then it was moved to the University of Washington. And our local newspaper managing editor, Joe Haidt, became involved with this. And the DART Center thought that they needed to train journalists on, first, how to report on traumatic events. Second, how to treat the families that have lived through traumatic events when you're interviewing them. And third, and this is why it's so special to me, that reporters need to learn to take care of themselves. That by your reporting on a traumatic event, that means that you have lived the event as well. After the Oklahoma City bombing, Joe Haidt and the people at the DART Center printed thousands of these little books. And it was on how to report, how to take care of yourself. And Kevin, I think, if this were my book, I would give it to you, having seen 2 assassinations. But anyway, thank you, yes. Yeah, that's right. Oops, a little Freudian slip, huh? But this talks about how you need to take care of yourself. And it's actually on the dartcenter.org website. This little book has now turned into this multi-page document of how to do better reporting at Katrina and other things like that. Whatever you're faced with, the people of South Carolina, after they do this, after they cover this, they're going to need to learn to take care of themselves as well. After the Oklahoma City bombing, maybe you remember this Time magazine, and there was exactly what you were talking about, showing Mcveigh, but also the little inset picture is the picture of Bailey Allman, the young baby. Bailey Allman, of course, was one of the children that was lost in the Murrah building. But this fireman with Bailey Allman was a student at my college. And so there were other students at my college, because it's a community college, and we had adults, that one woman suffered guilt, awful guilt, because the morning of the Murrah bombing, she was at the dentist. And perhaps you've heard of survivor guilt. And then there was a long, drawn-out thing of, do you get your name on the wall for surviving, or do you get your name on the wall for whatever? And so all those issues that you were talking about. So it created better reporting, a sensitivity to victims, and then care and education. As a result of this, the DART Center has created a training program where before you send your students out to become reporters, where they will have to face traumatic events. I had never planned on doing that. I was a talk show host. I was in the studio, but then I found myself interviewing families at the Family Center, and they wanted to talk about their families. And so then it became apparent that reporters need to take care of themselves. So as a result of this, the DART Center has developed a program where you hire professional actors and you give them scenarios of a fire or a flood or whatever, and you have your students go and interview these actors about these events. Now, some people poo-poo role play, but what I saw my students come away with as a result of even having to talk to someone that is sobbing and carrying on and all that was very beneficial. So I wanted to leave you with one thing, and it is the only joyful moment I had during that week of weeks. After that Wednesday, I went in on Thursday and took some shifts. On Friday, I took some shifts. On Saturday, it poured rain. Maybe you remember all this. And this was before headlights were on all the time on cars. And so as a show of solidarity, the community all turned their lights on and drove around in the rain with their lights on. And on that Sunday, perhaps you remember the Healing of the Heartland ceremony. It was telecast live nationally, and Billy Graham came to Oklahoma City, President and Mrs. Clinton, a whole bunch of dignitaries came to Oklahoma City for the Healing of the Heartland ceremony. My radio station asked me if I would come up on Sunday morning and do grief counseling with a qualified grief counselor and let people of Oklahoma City talk about their feelings on the air and all that. I did that, and it was very, very moving. I want to keep this short. You know, talk show hosts talk 20 minutes and then they go to commercial. So anyway, so I did 3 hours of grief counseling, and then it was time for the Healing of the Heartland ceremony. Well, in the radio station, even though we had this little board that was 2 tin cans and a string, we had set up 3 black and white TVs so that we could see what the TV coverage was like. Because, you know, back then it was all competition. And so we had 3 TVs set up, and we had our little board, and I did my grief counseling, and then someone brought us food. Oh, radio stations never get food. We had this incredible buffet of food, and I thought, oh, when I get through with this grief counseling, I'm going to eat this food, and I'm just going to watch this, and it's going to be wonderful. And so I did the grief counseling. I thanked the grief counselor, and I said, we now take you to the Oklahoma State Fairgrounds for the Healing of the Heartland ceremony. And my director came in, and they went, and I flipped the switch, and now they were talking about the people, you know, it's like the red carpet, people coming in to the arena and all this stuff. And I went over and I got me some grapes. And I thought, this is incredible. I've got food. And I was flipping grapes and I was watching these 3 black and white TVs. And I thought, well, this is pretty good. I'm glad they're covering this. I can kind of keep track of what's going on. And I said to my news director, I said, do you have a program of what they're going to do at this thing? And he said, oh, I think I do. And he printed out a thing and he handed it to me. And I said, oh, this is really cool. So-and-so's going to sing and they're going to have this. And then Billy Graham's going to talk. That's really great. And then I looked up on the TV and they were showing Billy Graham and the Clintons and all this stuff. And then they showed this moment of incredible, very touching, where they brought in the rescue dogs. And the rescue dogs all had on red kerchiefs. And when they came in, everybody in the arena stood and gave them a standing ovation. I mean, it was just spectacular. And I was sitting there flipping these grapes. I was thinking, you know, this is just so, this is very moving. And I'm so glad I get to see this. And our news director came in and he said, they've lost the feed. And he came over and he flipped the switch and he said, you're on. This is Gwin Faulconer, and I'm coming to you from the Healing of the Heartland ceremony. So I start watching the TV, and I just start saying what I see. I said, oh, and it's so moving now because I see President and Mrs. Clinton here sitting with Mrs., you know, Billy and Ruth Graham, and next to them are Governor and Frank Keating, and in just a few moments, they're going to start the ceremony. But I must share with you all what has touched my heart today. I've got to tell you about the most incredible moment I have seen, and it's when they brought in the rescue dogs. Let me describe them for you. There was a German Shepherd, and he had on a little red kerchief, and as he came in, he was prancing because he was so proud, and he got a standing ovation. And it just touched my heart to see the crowd cheer for this rescue dog and all that. And then I said, and so in just a few moments, we will be hearing from, and I had the name of the singer, I've forgotten it now. And I said, and then of course, so-and-so's going to happen, and this is going to happen. And then of course, the message will be brought to us from Reverend Billy Graham. And the news director came back in and he said, great job. You're done. And he flipped the switch. And I just about collapsed. 2 years later, I'm at a store buying something, and I'm checking out, and I'm, you know, probably buying toilet paper or something. And the woman said, is this all for you? And I said, yes, it is. Thank you very much. And she said, are you Gwin? And I said, yes. Are you Gwin Faulconer? I said, yes. I have been wanting to ask you something for 2 years. And I thought she could call me anytime, but anyway. And I said, what is it? And she said, oh, the healing of the Heartland ceremony. The way you talked about it. I have been wanting to know this for 2 years. Was it really as wonderful as you said? And I said, it was exactly as I saw it. So I hope before you send your students out, you will consider looking at the DART Center thing. And I want to share this one final thing. Tragedies and Journalists, a guide for more effective coverage. Reporters, editors, photojournalists, and news crews are involved in the coverage of many tragedies during their lifetimes. They range from wars to terrorist acts to airplane crashes to natural disasters to fire to murders, all having victims, all affecting their communities, but all having lasting memories. When we send our students out or when we send our reporters out, we need to remember to help them take care of themselves. Thank you so much. It's been such an honor.
Okay, we've got a few minutes for just a couple of questions. So first hand up.
Some of the boring scholarly question for Jody. What guides you in your research on searching for the social impact of law? Often when we think of law, it's kind of its own world, its own language. It has a social impact. What guides you in your research of that social impact?
I think that's the human story that's at the heart of every legal case. I mean, there's often more than one human story. I know with Mcveigh's trial, there was, I think, 3 or 5 days, 3 days of survivor testimony, family member testimony. And when I sit down and talk with these folks about the impact that law has on their lives, whether it's in medicine or family law or terrorism, I think there are trends and patterns, themes that run through these stories, and that is actually what I try to bring out. The hardest thing, and especially in my book, is stepping aside and realizing that, like Gwin, like Kevin, you are also a participant in these events, but trying to acknowledge that participation and at the same time privilege your participants' voices.
Others?
Watch out, I have more stories.
I'd like to hear that.
Okay, then I will. Jody, I find the most fascinating part of your work is, well, it's all fascinating, but is the idea of the victims, the survivors, considering the execution to be a silencing rather than an execution, and actually using that term. Is this happening with other, the Boston? So this is it. This is a thing.
I think so, and I think so with Mcveigh, and if you remember what the media was like in 1995, you didn't have a whole lot of control. There was little internet, little widespread use of the internet. You probably were pretty much hostage to what was in the newspaper, hostage to what was on the evening news. And actually, so many survivors and family members recorded whole libraries of videotape, saved newspapers. They have their own archives. Who knows how the memorial is ever going to process this when they get these one day. These entire enormous collections, but they never watched it as we consume media today, or they watched it all the time. So it's complete avoidance or it's complete saturation, and very, very little in between. And nowadays, if you don't want to see the pictures in a news story, you can copy and paste, or you can print it out. And we have more control over how we consume media. And what's very interesting is if you look at 9/11, and if you look at Boston, and if you look at Aurora, in fact, people don't feel like the perpetrators, like Mcveigh, are as much of a presence in their lives as people here felt that Timothy McVeigh was. And I think that's because not only have they learned to look away, but also the media has gotten better at showing other representations, showing other stories, privileging other voices, right? And so, in fact, one of the groups that started after Aurora was a group called Notoriety, where they're actually pleading with media not to show James Holmes's picture. So I think that's certainly a trend that we see in the future, and that's a healthier trend, right? Because no longer are people captive audiences in some sense of their media.
I don't know, Kevin. I think after all those years working in Texas, I still got to believe that they got to say, fry the bastard, right? I mean, do you think that's a?
Well, I mean, I'll take a little bit of issue. We were one of the hostage takers, where you turned some parts of the market turned to get your news back then. It was indeed, as Jody says, the market is dramatically different now. I mean, it's incredibly different how people get their news. But to the point of how there is a de-emphasis on the actors in these cases, I think to an extent it's ignoring the problem. We saw in Oregon just last week where the sheriff refused to name the individual who was involved in that. That's fine if you're a private citizen, but he's the sheriff. It's his job to provide the information related to the case. He may feel victimized because it's his community, but it's his obligation to provide the information that we need, and we have a right to. You can ignore it if you want, and that's certainly everybody's right. And you can find other aspects of the case that you think are more relatable or more fulfilling. But, and I have a bias here, because every time one of these happens, it's like, okay, Kevin, you're part of a team that finds out who is this person. And so I speak from that point of view. But at the same time, I find myself looking at various officials involved in these cases who've taken that stance, who want to make a political statement. And, that's fine if you're not a public official. But if you are, you also have an obligation to provide the information that we have a right to. And I also think that even in the Oklahoma City bombing case, there was a struggle at the time because we had never seen anything quite like this, ever, right? And I think the struggle was with prosecutors, defense lawyers, and the media, and people who consumed the media over what exactly to do. And I think for all of the lasting legacies that will live on after Oklahoma City, one will not. And that's and that is, I think, as reporters, we will never get that close to terrorist defendants like that ever again. To be able to sit in front of Mcveigh for 45 minutes was incredibly enlightening to me, even though I wasn't able to report it until he was dead. But you gained an understanding of maybe a snapshot in time of what that person was like, what perhaps drove that person. I think that's unfortunate, because after 9/11, in the hyper-security world that we live in now, we will not get a mile as close to another terrorist defendant, if that close.
Not even with this?
Not even with that.
Can I follow up with a quick story?
Sure.
So last April, before the panel started, we were talking and actually about this very issue. And I think Kevin picked up on a very profound danger too, that these evils that are out there start to become nameless if we don't name them. And actually survivors and family members want to find out who these people are and what brought them to that point. They just don't want to be confronted by their image time after time again. But I attended at the library near the Boston Marathon finish line, there was an exhibit that was only open for about a few weeks. And there were tons of tennis shoes, there were tons of cards that people left basically saying, "We love you, Boston." But it seemed like this little dark cloud had descended upon Boston, and this evil had taken place, and then the cloud lifted, leaving blood and gore and chaos everywhere. And nowhere was this named as an act of terrorism. Nowhere was were the Tsarnaev brothers named. And you kind of wondered how we confront this if we learn to look away. And I think there's a story here in the memorial too. They used to turn away from Mcveigh and Nichols in the story of their prosecutions and Mcveigh's execution. They used to have a light side and a dark side, so you could go through and concentrate on the survivors and family members. And actually, then they got all the evidence back, and they can't do that anymore. So if you go today, they tell that story along with the stories of the survivors and family members in equal measure.
Can I add a little bit? One of the things I was surprised about with family members is they want to talk about their family. They want, I mean, if you know anything about Compassionate Friends, it's an organization for parents that lose their children. They want to talk about those children, even years later. They want to still talk about them. And I think one of the things that happened after Oklahoma City is we learned to talk about the departed, those that were lost. I mean, we will not forget is one of our mantras around here. And certainly with Boston, we've seen this, and it's continued on. And I think the media has been so much better at honoring the dead rather than making it all about just the person that did the awful deed. It's so much better than it used to be. And I think that started perhaps with Oklahoma City, and it has continued on, that we've just learned to do better. At Oklahoma City, one of the bad stories I would tell you is the national media came in and they were terrible. No, I mean it. They faked credentials to get into the children's hospital to get pictures of burned and broken children. They did awful things. The local media seemed to be very sensitive because it was their community, their families, and all that. And I'm not picking on you particularly, but who am I? Who is it always? Geraldo's people, Oprah's people. I mean, the national people, Inside Edition, those more tabloid shows did whatever it took to get the story. And I think maybe that still goes on. I don't know as much. Sure. But I think we're better at reporting all these things.
You know, I think that, though, it just personally, I think that was underway before Oklahoma City, and I'll tell you why. Is the worst mass murder in U.S. history before Oklahoma City was the Luby's massacre in Killeen, Texas. And I was the supervising editor on that story for the Houston Chronicle. And we made it a point on that one because in Texas, there was one of these bizarre stories every year. And it was traumatic for reporters to go cover it. I mean, Kevin can tell you. I mean, Texas just, for some reason, has two things a year. And it's, you know, a Coca-Cola truck hitting a school bus full of kids. It's a school bus full of kids going off a hill in the hill country in a flood. It's, right, Kevin? I mean, it's a slave ranch outside of San Antonio. I mean, just awful, awful kinds of things. Cephalitic babies down in the Rio Grande. I mean, just awful stuff. And we made it, when the George Hennard thing happened in Killeen at the Luby's, where he drove his truck in, and he pulled out 2 automatic weapons, killed 21 people, and then killed himself. A matter of seconds. And on Boss's Day, high noon, a packed restaurant. And we made the decision that we were going to make no reporter spend any more than 72 hours and then bring them home. And we kept, you know, and that went on for more than a month into that town, reporters going in and out of there. The other thing we did is that we made sure that day we put an open records request into the Bureau of Motor Vehicles for all the victims' driver's license pictures. And we did a whole page with a vignette about every single victim. Because that conversation came up is, let's don't make this Hennard guy, his name was George Hennard, let's don't make Hennard the story. The story are these 21 people. And the people in the DMV were like, what? What are you doing? I mean, and people in the newsroom were like, you're really going to do this? We said, yeah, we're going to do it. And we even got it for the 2 out-of-state people. I think there were 2 out-of-state people, one from New Jersey and somebody from somewhere else. We got their pictures, and we actually did that. Called the relatives, called the families, interviewed them, and the families were like, are you kidding? You're going to, like, recognize my... It was really kind of a... So I think their thinking was there at the time, but it wasn't in any kind of formalized way. But anyway, so...
Well, the Dart Center is now at the Columbia School of Journalism. It has moved, and they have really seized it. The research arm is at the University of Tulsa. The psychology professor there has taken the research aspect of it. But
And Joe Hyde's work was amazing.
And Joe Hyde's work, to be in the business and embrace, I mean, I don't know about you, but every newsroom I was ever around, if you cried or if you did anything like that, you were shamed. How, you know, you don't act like that. You're supposed to suck it up and go on. And because of the Dart Center, it's kind of let us help you do it. I don't know, after you've seen these executions,
Nobody's, it's interesting that you talk about that now, because the only way it comes up in the newsroom ever is for people who are covering combat. And there was a rule, at least at our place, that if you went overseas, if you were in Iraq, that you wouldn't stay there for more than 5-6 weeks at a time, and then they would pull you out. 5-6 weeks at a time was still a long time, and most of the time you were there on your own. But there was at least some thought given to that. But I think there's not a whole lot of thought given to it at the time, because there is, especially now, newsroom staffs are thin. They're as thin as they've ever been, and there are just not people out there to do the work that used to be done by many. So you're often out for weeks at a time. I mean, you're getting days off, but there's not a whole lot of talk of that in the newsroom.
Anybody have a final question, or? Okay, just once again, panel came from the Council of Communications Association, and Gwin was nominated to the panel by the Broadcast Education Association. Kevin was nominated to the panel by me on your behalf. I took a unilateral decision. Not going to ask you for a vote. And Jody came to us through the auspices of the International Communication Association. So let's give them all